Today's daf is daf Chav Tes, and we're talking about a machlokes between Rav and Rav Huna, Rav Kana, sorry, about chatzi, meaning when you have a situation of mechza, it's 50%, is that considered like a rove, or is it not considered like a rove? So we got up to Tashma, which is 6 lines down from the top of Chav Tes Amud Aleph. And the Gemara at this point is going to completely undermine the Shita of Rav as we understood it and reinterpret Rav as referring to something with regard to the Korban Pesach. Because we learned in a Brisa, Harei shahaya chatzi kana pogum. Now, with regard to the kana, so the halacha is that if part of the kana, which we said was the windpipe or the trachea, was perforated, it was cut, there was a hole, and the shochet hosif olav kolshu ugmaro, so the shochet carried over from half to majority. Shchita sokshera. The shchita is kosher. Now, we'll see later that the veshet, which we're not talking about now, which is the esophagus, there, even the smallest, slightest hole makes it into a treifa. But now we're not talking about the veshet, but rather the kana. So the kana would only become treif if most of the simon was cut. But here in this case, there was only a hole of less than half. He put the knife into the hole and he continued the shchita and widened the hole so that now rove of the simon has been cut. Then the shchita is valid. So here's the analysis that's going to refute Rav. If you're going to tell me that once it's mechzal mechza, then that's already considered rove. Now the halacha of a kana is that if rove of the kana is perforated, has a hole in it, then it's treif. Again, as opposed to the veshet, where any hole, smallest as it is, would make it treif. But in the case of a kana, if more than half, now according to Rav, once you have half, it's considered more than half. And the Brisa says, "Hayachetzi kana pogum," then it's a treifa. How could you possibly be machshir the shchita? Now, in my mind, just making a comment, if you don't mind, this Gemara is a pella to me because Rav is only talking about a conceptual, halachic, legal status of mechza. Treifa depends upon whether the animal will survive or won't survive. But I guess even the laws of treifa are defined by shiurim. Shiurim means by specific legal measurements. And the measurement of treifa is rove. And that's a halachic measurement. And therefore, once Rav says that mechza is considered like rove, then the bird is treif. Omar Rava. Now, Rav is going to say something that I think is a little bit similar to what I wanted to say, although his language is different. He says, Shani le'inyan shreifa, Rav would be modeh, would concede that in the case of defining whether the bird is a treif or not, we're not going to apply the principle of mechza kerov to be in rov hanira le'inayim. Now, I think the phrase, again, the literal translation is rove that's visible, to the eyes. But I think what Rava is talking about here when he says rov hanira le'inayim, he's referring to the reality, the physical reality. He uses the terms nira le'inayim to demonstrate that it's real. It's something, tangible, substantial. You could see it. Omalei Abaye. Now Abaye is going to introduce a Kal Vachomer to reject Rava's logic about, Rov Hanir Leinayim. And it seems that Abaye's Kal Vachomer is what you call in boxing, I think it's TKO. This is the Gemara absolutely applauds and accepts Abaye. V'lo kol dekenhu, isn't it a Kal Vachomer, kolshke? Uma treifa. And now at this point, we're going to the Veshet. Till now, we're talking about the Kana, the trachea. Now we're talking about the esophagus. Dibimashu mitarfa. If you have the smallest hole in the esophagus, which is called the Veshet, then the animal is a treifa. So you see how severe the laws of treifa are. Is heicha de bein and ruba, and nevertheless, when we establish the halacha in not the esophagus but rather the treifa, that in order for it to be considered treifa, you have to have a cut of rov. Be'ina rov hanir leinayim, so you've got to have a rov in order to declare the bird as treifa. Ishchita the adiika ruba lo miskashra. In other words, there's no such thing as a koldahu or a mashu. The mashu applies in the laws of treifa, but when we shift over to the laws of shchita, then with regard to shchita, there's no din of koldahu. So therefore, if the laws of treifa are sort of less demanding and less strict than the laws of shchita, because within the world of treifa, even a mashu could generate treifa, whereas in shchita we need a rov. And if in treifa we need a rov hanikar leinayim, for example, in the case of the kana, not the veshet, then in shchita, where there is no such thing at all as a mashuhu, we need a rov in order to consider the shchita of that simon valid. Lo kolske de be'inan rov hanir leinayim. How much more so when we get to the concept of rov, and you need a rov in order for the shchita to be kosher. Certainly, you need a ruba de nikar leinayim. So therefore, Abaye is saying that certainly Rav would be modeh, based on the compelling logic of this Kal Vachomer, that in order for the shchita to be a valid shchita, you've got to have rov hanir leinayim. Because if rov hanir leinayim is the halacha that applies to treifa in the case of the kana, then how much more so in shchita, where shchita doesn't have at all, that special allowance for a mashu, then certainly you need a ruba to nikar leinayim. And therefore, based on this Kal Vachomer, the Gemara concludes, Elo dekuli alma, even Rav would agree that mechzal mechseina karov. Then when the Torah requires shchita of rov simon, Rav would concede that half the simon is not called rov. So now at this point, we're at a fork in the road, and the Gemara is going to offer a whole new approach to Rav. And that's why I made a comment yesterday, if you recall, that I didn't understand how this sugya of rov was swept under the carpet. It's a mind-boggling sugya that half is considered like a rov. How come I never found it anywhere? But the answer might be right here that the Gemara actually rejects this, and Rav never said it. V'chiyitma de Rav, And the machlok shin Rav and Rav Kahana about whether mechza or mechzas kirov is linyan Pesach Idmar, as far as the laws of bringing the Korban Pesach bituma are concerned. Now, just by way of introduction, there's a special halacha in Korban Pesach that if less than half of the tzibur are tmeim, then those are considered individuals, and they have to bring the Korban Pesach Sheni on the 14th of Adar of Iyar. However, if the majority of the Kahal Yisrael are tmeim, like let's say, for example, where Bezdin might have given a mistaken, erroneous horah, and most of the Jews followed it and became tmeim, so in that case, they bring the Korban Pesach B'tumah on the 14th of Nisan in its proper time. What do we do in a case? Again, it seems statistically very rare or unlikely, but we calculated all the men who are obligated to Korban Pesach, and we got to 50-50, exactly mechza mechza. And here we have the machlok shin Rav and Rav Kahana. Rav Amar mechza mechza kirov. We consider it as if the majority of the people are tmeim, and therefore will bring the korban bituma on the 14th of Nisan, because the Torah was matir when Rov HaTzibur Tmeim to bring it on the 14th of Nisan. You don't have to push it off. Rav Kahana Omer mechza mechza kirov. You don't have a rov. And therefore, you don't have a tzibur. The tzibur requires a rov. You don't have a rov. You only have 50%. And therefore, those 50% that are tahorim will bring the korban in its time. Those 50% of tmeim are individuals. They're not at tzibur. They don't have the chalosh shem tzibur. Therefore, they'll bring the korban Pesach and Pesach Sheni a month down the line. The hasamai time of the Rav. What was Rav basing himself on when he said that half the tzibur creates a tzibur? The chsiv, he derived it from a pasuk. Ish kiyeh tamei lenefesh. The Torah emphasized the word ish and introduces Pesach Sheni if the ish was contaminated to a nefesh, meaning to a human corpse. And that means that when the Torah establishes Pesach Sheni, it's ish nidche v'ein tzibur nidche. And Rav apparently understood that half the tzibur is considered a chaloshem tzibur. They have the legal status of a tzibur, maybe because of the extra ish that comes to be marbe the tzibur, even if it's only half the tzibur. Okay, now we go on. Rov echad b'of. The Mishnah says, and seems to repeat itself from the Reisha to the Sefer, that all you need is rov. Rov of the Sima. In a case of an oath, with the exception of Olas ha'of, that's going to be the one exception, all you need is rov of one of the two simanim, and we had a machlokas whether it's the Veishet Dafka or we accept the Shita that's either the Veishet or the Kana. And Tanina Chada Zimna, yet the Mishnah at the Sefer repeats itself and says, Ruba Shalecha Kamo. Why the repetition? Which is the question that we asked when we first learned the Mishnah. And now the Gemara, for almost the balance of our daf today, or at least till the top part of Amud Beis, is going to bring many logical analyses that prove that the Reisha is B'shchitas Chullin and the Sefer B'shchitas Kodshim. And in Shchitas Kodshim, the Shchita is the first of the four avodos. It's not really an avoda Shchita because it's Ksher Bizarre, but nevertheless it culminates in Zrikas Adam. Omrav Hoshaya, Chada B'chulin Chada B'chulin. How do I know that the... No, I'm sorry. We're not yet to how do I know? But if we assume that the Mishnah repeats itself, we don't know which part of the Mishnah is referring to Kodshim, which part to Chulin, but we need both Chulin and Kodshim. Tzricha. The Iyashmin and Chulin, if I only knew Rov of a Simon, in the case of Chulin, And again, in an oaf, it means that's all you need is rove of one simon. In the case of behavior, you need rove times two for each of the two simonim. Is hacha hasam hu desagile beruba. Bishum de lav ledamu tzarch aval kodshim de ledamu tzarch emo. I might think lo tiske leberuba ade ikakula. In kodshim, the shchita has to culminate in zrikas adam. And for the Zrikas Adam al Gabi Mizbeach, which is the last culminating avoda, the four avodas, we need a certain volume of dam. And therefore we might think that if you only slaughter rove of the simonim, then the dam is not going to spurt out, and the Kabbalah Saddam will be a limited volume of dam, and that's not enough. So the Torah might require, even though in Chullin rove is enough, but in the case of Kodshim, I might think that you need kulo. And therefore, I need the Sefer to tell me no, that even in Kodshim, Rubo is Kikulo. And he asked me in Kodshim, now, if the Mishnah had only told me that in Kodshim, Rubo is enough, Yishum Dil Davut Sarach, Aval Chulim Dil Adam Lo Tzarach Ema Bepalga Sagile. Wow. So again, it works like this. If the Mishnah had only told me Kodshim, start again. If the Mishnah had only told me Chulin, I would have said that in Kodshim, you need Kulo. So the Mishnah's coming to Mechadish said, no, Rubo is sufficient. In the reverse situation, if the Mishnah had only told me Kodshim, I would say that the rove of Kodshim is in order to guarantee that there's enough dam. But in the case of Chulin, where we don't need dam, therefore maybe mechza would be enough. And here the Gemara, I think, has in mind that Havamina, the original logic of Rav, the way we first understood Rav. So now the Gemara wants to know high Chulin, high Kodshim. Right? You got a Reish and a Sefer. Now, I'm not sure if the Gemara is just asking this question out of curiosity, because my nafkamina, who cares? As long as we have two, and two means Chulin and Kodshim, with the logic that we just analyzed, then who cares which one is which? I mean, flip a coin. But maybe the Gemara thinks that there is some sort of nafkamina if you interpret the Reisha as either Chulin or Kodshim and vice versa in the Sefer. I don't know. But Omer of Kahana, and now we're going to have a whole series of Amoraim, one after the other, who apply each one his own individual analytic logic to prove that the Reisha is Chulin and the Sefer is Kodshim. Mistaba Reisha b'Chulin v'Sefer b'Kodshim mimai. Midik tani hashochet. Now watch what goes on over here. In the case of Chulin, whether you deal with a behemoth or an oaf, you're always dealing with shchita. But if you're dealing with Kodshim, then in Kodshim, with regard to ophos, I grant you that with regard to kodshim of animals, of behemoth, you require shchita. But with regard to ophos, the law is that there's no shchita, there's only molika. It should have said not hashochet, but hamolek. So the Gemara is not happy with this. The Gemara says, Elamai sefer bekodshim. So now you're okay, that sefer is bekodshim. And the Reisha that uses the word hashochet can't be referring to kodshim because in ophos it's malika, not shchita. I don't get it. It says in the Reisha, in the Sefer, shchita so kshera. So obviously we talk about shchita. Malika so kshera miboile. It should have mentioned, something about malika if it's talking about kodshim. Holo kasha. The Gemara says that's not a problem. Why does it mention shchita in the Sefer, even though we're talking about Kodshim? I do the solik mibehema, tani nami shchitasu kshera. In other words, in the Sefer, he leaves off with the discussion about a behema to tell you that rov simon is enough. So once he's talking about behema and Kodshim could only be shchita, then he adds the word shchitasu kshera. Ela reisha, but in the case of the reisha, who says we're talking about behema? On the contrary, Michti al ofkoi. He's referring immediately right afterwards to oaf, And Isal Kedakta B'Kodshim HaMolek Miboile. It can't be referring to Kodshim if we're talking about an oath, because in oath, in Kodshim, there's no Shechita, but rather there's Molika. So that's Roman numeral number one. Now we go on to Roman numeral number two, Rav Shimi Bar Ashi Omar, Reisha B'Chulin Mehoch. I have a different analytic logic to prove that the Reisha is referring to Chulin. Why? The Ketani Echad B'Of, right? When the Mishnah says that all you need is to cut one of the two simanim, then by definition we're referring to an oath. An oath needs only shchita of one siman, a behemoth needs two siman. The Isal Kedakta B'Kodshim, and if we're going to say that the ratio which says that all you need is to shecht one siman, as it says, Echad B'Of. Well, guess what? Echad B'Of is absolutely correct, straight across the board in Chulin, but not in Kodshim. Why? Ha'ika olasav to buy shnei simanim. In olasav, you can't allow for one siman, you need two simanim. So since the Mishnah refers to halacha of one siman, then it is referring to the oath, but dafka oath of chulin. Because if it would be oath of kodshim, then in the case of olasa oath, you would require two simanim. Elamai, I don't understand. So sefer b'kodshim, I don't get it. You're still going to have a problem with olasa oath because it says rov echad b'oath. Ha'ika olasa oath to boy shnei simanim. So when we get to the sefer, and again, the sefer reiterates what we had in the Reisha, that all you need is rov of one simon. That can't be true in kodshim with regard to olasa oath. So the Gemara answers, my rov echad, rov shall kol echad v'echad. That with regard to olasa oath, the word rov here is not rov of one simon, but one rov of each of the simonim, and that's called rov shall kol echad v'echad. Why didn't he just say it straight that you need rov of shnei simonim? But Dinu, actually, technically, he should have said the lisnei. He should have written the lisnei rov shnei simonim. But came into ikachata, since we're dealing with oath in kodshim, there are two categories of oath in kodshim. One of which the ola requires two simanim, the other of which is the chatas requires only one siman. Right? He didn't want to say absolutely rov shnayim because that's not true. It's true in the case of olas oath, but not in the case of behemoth oath, of chatas oath. Now we have another Roman numeral number 3. Rav Papa Amar Reisha B'Chulin Mehacha. What does it say in the Reish? It says the Ketani Rabbi Yehuda Omer Achi Yishchor Savridim Upligi Rabbanan Alei. There's machlokes whether when you shech the bird, you have to also slaughter. You have to sever the vridim. Right? We said the jugular veins, and that could only work out if we're dealing with chulin. It can't work out according in kodshim. Iyam Bishleima B'Chulin is shapir. Then we understand very well that, as we discussed maybe 2 days ago, that the bird is usually roasted whole, and therefore the dam is not going to come out so fast. So therefore, while you're doing the shechita, make sure to cut the vridim and get the dam out. But if you'll argue the opposite argument, namely that the Reisha of our mission is referring to kodshim, am I pligi rabbanan alei? Why would the Rabbanan disagree? You certainly want to cut the vridim because you need the maximum volume of dam. Hu atzmol dam hu tzarech. So the Rabbanan would agree to Rabbi Yehuda's position that we should encourage the shochet in kodshim to shecht the vridim, so that then the makabalas adam will be able to write the dam hanefesh will be able to receive in his mizrak as much dam as he needs for the zrika. Rav Ashi Amar Omrun 4. Seifa b'kodshim. I'm going to prove to you that the seifa is referring to kodshim, and therefore by proselytization the Reish is referring to chulin. To katani, it says in the Mishnah later on Daf Lamed. It says Ashochet Shnei Roshin Kiechad Shchitaso Kishere. The man, it's a fella, he puts two animals, one by next to the other, and he has a knife, a shechita knife, and he just shechts through one and then through the other. And we're going to see that in kodshim, that's unacceptable. Hashochet yevid in lechatchilu lo. Iyam epishle bekodshim. Hainu de lechatchilu lo. Oh, I'm sorry, I made one mistake here. I correct myself. That in Chullin, it's okay to shecht two heads at once, and that's even lechatchila. But in the Mishnah, and again, the Mishnah is printed on Daf Lamed, but it's the sefer of our Mishnah. It says Hashochet b'di'evet. And why is that Shochet b'di'evet? That's only in Kodshim, because in Kodshim, as we're going to soon learn from Tani Rav Yosef, lechatchila you shecht one animal at a time and not two. To Tani Rav Yosef Tizbach. Okay, now this is a drasha which is based on a principle which is called Yesh Aim L'Masores. Yesh Aim L'Masores means that if there's some sort of a discrepancy, that's the word I mean, or a conflict between the way the text is written in the Torah, that's called the Masores, or the way it is read in the Torah, which is called Aim Lemikra, Mikra meaning Lashon Kriya. So we're going to accept that Mandi Omar, which is a plugta all across the Shas, that Yesh Aim Lemesores. And it all depends on how it's written. Now, first of all, let me read the Pasuk. The Pasuk says, V'chi sizbechu, zevach shlom l'Hashem, l'rtzonchem tizbechuhu. Now watch this. Under the ches, there's a kubutz, which means it's chaser. There should have been a vav after the ches of tizbechuhu. And that would have indicated that you could have two in plural. But that's the way we read it. But as far as the Masoros is concerned, the vav is not there. And therefore we're going to read it tizbach in the singular, who, it. And therefore, lo yehei shnayim shochtim zevach echad. Right, we're not going to double up and have two people shecht, one kodesh, one karvan. Tizbechu shelo yeh echad shochet shnei zvachim. So again, if you would interpret the pasuk with the extra vav based on Yeshem Mikra, which means the way traditionally we read it, as if there were a vav there, which is not a vav in the written Torah, then tizbechu would be in the plural. The Omer of Kahana tizbechehu ksiv. The way it's written, which is called Yesh Aim L'Masores, then you vocalize it as tizbechehu. Why? Because you don't have that vav after the ches. And therefore, based on this drasha, the brisa of Rav Yosef comes to the conclusion that we're not going to allow lechatchila the plural shchita. And lo yeh echad shochet shnei zvachim. Chullin, if you're going to tell me, right, and that's all that is lechatchila. But if you're going to tell me that the sefer of the Mishnah is referring to Chullin, then why does it say hashochet b'di'evet afilu lechatchila nami? You know, you can slaughter two animals at the same time with one stroke of the knife. And yet from the Mishnah, we learn that that's prohibited lechatchila. it must be talking about Kodshim. Okay, now what number are we up to? If we're counting, I think we're up to number five. The Afra of Shimon ben Lakish Sava Reisha B'chu the Sefer Kodshim from a different analytical position. The Omer of Shimon ben Lakish. So he's going to ask the question that we've been dealing with all along. Me'achas shaninu. In the Reisha we have Rubo shel echad kamohu. All you need is Rov. Lama shaninu. Why does it repeat itself in the Sefer? Rov echad bi'of. Rov shnayim v'behem. Comes along Reish Lakish and he says the following: Lefi sheshaninu. Okay, where is this Mishnah? Oh, now we're getting to the avodas Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippur. And lechatchila, we want the Kohen Gadol to do all the avodos, even those avodos like the Tamid, which have nothing to do with Yom Kippur, that's daily the whole year round. Hevil lo esatomid. Now, we want to make it a little easier for the Kohen Gadol. He has such a burden over the course of Yom Kippurim. So, krotzo umerak acher shchitos al. Krotzo means that the Kohen Gadol begins the shechita, and then umerak, which always means to complete, the completion of the shechita is done by someone else, a regular Kohen Hedjot, to alleviate the Kohen Gadol of all his responsibilities. But now we have a problem, because if we're going to assume that the Kohen Gadol has to do all the avodos, and now we're saying that the Gemar Shchita is done by a non-Kohen Gadol, meaning a Kohen Hedjot, then l'chora you might argue that the carbon is possible, even though again it's a Tamid Shel Boker, it doesn't require Kohen Gadol, but yet it requires Kohen Gadol because, as we'll soon see, all the avodos, even those that are not related to the day of Yom Kippur, are implemented by the Kohen Gadol. Is Yachal Lo Merek possible? Therefore, I might think that if the Shechita was never completed at all, then maybe, it's not enough. And as we said in the past, that Kodshim, we want to get at the dam, so we want to do a complete Shechita. Is Rov Echad Bi'of, Rov Echad B'Shnayim. Now we go over to the Sefer, and therefore in the Sefer, we're going to talk about Kodshim, then the Mishnah is coming to Mechadesh that you don't have to do Merak, that although Merak is L'chatchila, as we said, we want to alleviate the Kohen Gadol, but nevertheless we might think that it should be possible, that the requirement of Merak, of having another Kohen finish up the Shechita, is absolutely critical. So that's where the Mishnah in the Sefer is coming to. Anyway, we see clearly that Reish Lakish is applying the Reisha of the Mishnah to Chullin and the Sefer to Kodshim. So the Gemara says, I don't understand Reish Lakish. Omar Mar, Reish Lakish is saying that Yachal Lo Merak Yehi Pasul, that if another Kohen Hedjot didn't complete the Shechita, it would be possible.